on the disconnect between business and professional ethics, or why there is no such thing as business ethics. Right from the start, you may be wondering why we're looking at this issue of a distinction, of there being a distinction between business and professional ethics. And there's a few reasons for this. First, for many people, business, or those who work in business, are professionals. And this brings with it some confusions. Because to philosophers, a profession carries with it moral distinctions that we don't find in non-professions. And as we go along, we'll further clarify what we mean by this. But many people equate business people with professionals. And when they do that, oftentimes they hold that business has some sort of ethical standard that's different than our everyday morality. So in part, the reason why we start here is that we want to distinguish between business practices, what goes on in business, and the morality that applies to business, and how that's different than other things that are professions in the philosophical sense of profession. So what we're really doing is offering some conceptual clarity. The rest of this course is going to be about business ethics. Now, as I said in that little parentheses, there's no such thing as business ethics. And what I mean by that is there's no different morality, or there's no separate morality for business. Our everyday morality applies to business. That's the sort of overarching theme of the entire course, that the morality that we use when dealing with our friends, when we deal with other people in society, those same ethical guidelines, those same ethical standards actually do apply in business. But this requires that we make the case, at least initially, that we can separate business from things like professions, which do in fact have their own set of moral standards. So to begin with, I'm holding that business persons, people who work in business, and by business I mean general sort of business practices, accounting, sales, management, marketing, and so forth, that those individuals, when engaging in that activity, those occupations, are not professions in the philosophical sense, in the technical philosophical sense. So this is one claim we're going to make. We're going to distinguish between business or occupations and professions. And then we're going to hold, and by making that distinction, show that business does not, in fact, have its own set of ethical standards. Now, this is a debated topic. There are those that think that business does, in fact, abide by, or business practices adhere to a different set of moral guidelines than people in everyday life. And so that's something that as we go through the course, we're going to discuss. This theme will come back over and over again. But right now, what we want to hold is we want to show, or I want to give you an argument, that in fact business is different than other sorts of professions. So business ethics, in essence, the core idea here is that business ethics is the same thing as everyday ethics. So when I say there's no such thing as business ethics, what I really mean is there's no such thing as a separate discipline or a separate set of ethical standards for business persons. Business ethics really is the application of everyday ethics in a business context. So let's talk about professions. Professions, or for an occupation to be a profession, it must be governed by moral rules, principles, privileges, and responsibilities that differ from our everyday morality. And this is what I mean by a profession in the moral sense. So a profession has a separate set of moral rules. The sort of classic example is that of the lawyer. So we talk about law being a profession and lawyers having a different moral code. That applies to the sorts of things like being able to lie to the court. Now, you or I lying in everyday life, that's a bad thing. If I lie to my friend, if I lie to a family member, we say, oh, you've done something morally wrong. Yet in law, we allow lawyers to stand up and say things like, my client is not guilty. Now, in fact, the lawyer, when saying that, when offering the plea for their client is really saying, my client is not legally guilty, is what they're actually saying. But we note that in cross-examination or in cases of summation, that lawyers are given the privilege of basically making the claim that their client is not guilty in fact. So the difference between being not guilty under the law and not guilty in fact, there's a very fine line. In fact, lawyers have this privilege, and some would argue the obligation, to convince a jury that their client is not in fact guilty, even if the lawyer knows. Even if the client has admitted their guilt to the lawyer is still allowed, and in fact required, to profess the innocence of their client. Now, you and I can't do that, at least not if we want to be good moral people. So professions are occupations that have special moral rules that apply only to them and only in the context of that profession. Now, many of you might be saying, well, that's not what I mean by profession, and that's true. In fact, in many instances, we don't use the notion of a profession in a very strict sense. So there are many non-moral senses in which we use the word profession. So sometimes when we talk about a professional, what we really mean is someone who receives compensation for their work. So a non-moral sense of profession, a non-moral sense might apply to something like someone who's an artist. There are those who do art as a hobby on the side, and there are those who sell their art, who do art for a living. So if you're a professional artist, that normally we mean something like, well, you receive compensation for your art. There's another sense of profession, and sometimes we mean by profession expertise. To be a professional means that there's a certain level of experience or expertise one has in a particular area. So while you might be a starving artist, it might be that you've had substantial training, have worked for many, many years, produced numbers of pieces of artwork, whatever that art may be, whether it's sculpture or painting or whatever. And we say, oh, they've got special skills, and so expertise. So we talk about business professionals this way. Well, that person's a professional. They've worked for several companies. They've organized several campaigns. They are experts in their field. So we talk about expertise. Again, this is a non-moral sense of the word profession. Now, also sometimes we refer to a professional as someone who brings a certain attitude to their work. So we can talk about someone behaving professionally. And this might apply to a fast food worker. So we might not say that a fast food worker is someone who's a professional. It was sort of odd to say that that's a profession. But on the other hand, we might say, oh, they dealt with that customer in a very professional manner. That customer had a complaint, and that employee took care of it very professionally. But that's an attitude one brings to one's work. Now, notice in all of those sort of examples, we're talking about non-moral senses. There's no special morality at place. Receiving compensation doesn't mean anything different. We can receive compensation for any number of types of work. We can be experts in a number of different areas. We can have a particular attitude, but those are all non-moral. And those aren't what we're concerned about when we're talking about professional. When we're talking about a professional, we're really talking about someone that has a different moral code than you or I. So we can sort of make a further distinction that between occupation, something someone does for work, and profession. Now, I want to be very clear that when we're talking about the distinction between an occupation and a profession, so here I'm holding that business, in fact, is an occupation, whatever it happens to be, whatever specific area of business is your occupation, and that professions are things that carry with them some other special features that occupations like. I'm not making a moral distinction between occupation and professions in the sense that one's better than the other. I'm not saying, well, oh, you just have an occupation while someone else has a profession. I'm not making any value judgments about these things. And we should be careful to remember that, because some people become very upset by this. They say, no, I'm a professional. That you're in some way degrading my work by calling it simply an occupation. And that's not what we're doing. What we're looking for is a certain clarity, and this conceptual clarity that I've already mentioned, so that we can sort of tease out the moral implications. Without making this sort of distinction, these things get very muddled. And talking about business as a profession loses our ability to distinguish certain practices as being good or bad. If we think business has its own set of moral standards, there are real world implications to that. So this is why we're making this distinction. We're saying that there's certain things are occupations and there are certain things that are professions. Now, how do we define professions? So this is a debated sort of area, but there are some fairly well accepted ways of viewing this, one more stricter than the other. So I want to just mention two right now. And the first is one by Bales, and this is necessary conditions of a profession. So one approach to distinguishing a profession from an occupation is to apply these three criteria. So for someone like Bales, for an occupation to be a profession, it has to have the following three. So when I say they're necessary conditions, what this means is you got to have all three of these. If your occupation doesn't have these things, then it's not a profession. So the first is extensive training. So for something to be a profession, it means that you have to train over a fairly long period of time. That training has to have an intellectual component. So a professional athlete, while they may have extensive training over a period of time, that training may not actually have much of an intellectual component. So generally we're speaking here of training and with the majority of that training having a substantial intellectual component, as in education, higher education, maybe advanced degrees, those sorts of things. So extensive training, an intellectual component of that training, and then it must provide a valuable or essential service to society. So for Bales, for something to be a profession, it has to have all three of these. So if it's simply extensive training, and that training has an intellectual component, and it might argue, for example, that someone with a business degree and perhaps even an MBA has had extensive training, and that training has an intellectual component, obviously. If that is not an essential service, if the training, so is marketing, for example, not to pick on marketing students, but is marketing something that's necessary for society? And I think it's pretty clear that if all marketing went away, we could still survive as a society, that my life wouldn't be changed all that much if marketing departments were gone. On the other hand, if you suddenly said to me, doctors are now gone, if I remove from our society doctors, that probably would cause some problems for me. In other words, that is an essential service. I am bound to get sick at some point. I'm going to need a doctor, and if I didn't have doctors, that'd be a pretty bad thing. So this is what Bales means when it's a valuable or essential service to society. It's not that it does some good, but that it's essential to the sort of functioning of society. Now, this is a pretty strict criteria because you might argue that there are certain sorts of occupations that seem to have some of these, if not all, but we don't want to say that necessarily it's just an occupation, but then in fact they might have something more akin to professional responsibility. So journalism is a sort of classic example. Under Bales' account, you don't need extensive training. Or maybe perhaps you do, maybe you need some experience, but that training doesn't necessarily have to have an intellectual component, but it still might provide a valuable service to society. So the fourth estate idea. Now, is a journalist a professional? Should they keep their sources protected? Do they have an obligation, morally speaking, to not sort of divulge their sources? Some states, in fact, they do, some they don't. So there's a sort of middle gray area, which is why some philosophers, such as Barber, say that, well, to be a professional or to define something, to pick something out as a profession, maybe you don't need these all three necessary conditions, but maybe there's a series of conditions, sufficient conditions, that some or most of these, if an occupation is some or most of these sort of criteria, then it's really a profession. So one is a high degree of systematic knowledge. You notice this is very similar to Bales, right? This idea, systematic knowledge, generally what we're talking about is something with a formal education, something like a college degree or requires some sort of college degree. It's orientated towards community interests. So again, this idea that for someone to be a professional, the profession itself is directed towards the good of society or the good of the community and not just the good of the individual. So you can see how, again, here's where business comes in. There might be a high degree of systematic knowledge, but is it really oriented to community interests or to business interests or to the business owner or to the individual working in business? And so you might say, well, yeah, the orientation really isn't towards the community. It's towards the business enterprise. Self-control is based on an internalized code of ethics. So in a profession, there is a set of code, a code of ethics that one follows. Maybe it's as being part of a professional organization. Maybe the organization has come up with a series of codes. Some of these codes may in fact be in law as well. But really, it's the idea that the person in the profession has a set of codes or code of ethics that they abide by. So doctors, again, the sort of classic example, right? They're to benefit their patient and do no harm. And there are other things as well. For instance, a doctor can't choose not to treat a patient. Doctors have obligations to help those. So if a doctor is outside the hospital and someone is injured, and they're in proximity to that individual, they actually are required. They can be held accountable if they don't. And this code of ethics, though, is internalized. Doctors are well aware that if a patient is put before them, that they're sort of honor bound to help that patient. And also, according to Barber, that we often have in a profession system of symbolic rewards. And what we mean by that is that oftentimes there are prizes that really it isn't the monetary gain of the prize, but the recognition for excellence. So a Pulitzer Prize would be the sort of symbolic rewards. While there might be a cash award with that, it's really the symbolism, right? The showing the excellence in one's profession, doing the work that one does. So for Barber, you don't have to have all of these. To be a profession doesn't mean you have all these conditions, but you should have most of these conditions. And if you do, then we can consider what you do, your occupation, a profession. But you notice that when we do this, there is this sort of idea that there is a code of ethics. There is a systematic knowledge, that there's a society or communal interest in what's being done. So they do, Bales and Barber share these, they just differ on how strict these conditions should be in making something or in determining or defining something as a profession. Now, the moral aspects of a profession I've already alluded to. And what I mean by the moral aspects of a profession is those things that professionals are obligated to do that others aren't. Now, in philosophy, we have sort of two ways of referring to this. So it's one way is to refer to this as the separatist thesis. Another way, when we're talking about the individual, we can talk in terms of role differentiated behavior. So the separatist thesis is the argument that professions have a separate and distinct morality. And we mean separate and distinct from our everyday morality. That's the separatist thesis. And what we've been holding here throughout, Bales and Barber both, is that once you define something as a profession, then that thing will have, in fact, its own separate code. And what goes along with that is that once an individual takes part in that profession, enters the role of the professional, then their behavior is different when they're doing or when they're operating as a professional. So some examples, which I've alluded to some of these already: law, medicine, psychology, education, nursing. These are all things that would meet the criteria of Barber or Bales. Law, I've already mentioned. Lawyers have obligations to be a zealous advocate for their client. What does that zealous advocacy means? It means that even if they know a witness is telling the truth, they have to try to poke as many holes in a witness's statement as possible. Why do they have to do this? Because they have an obligation to keep the confidentiality of their client. So let's take an example. Imagine a client comes to you and you're a lawyer. And the client says, I did in fact do this, but I'm pleading not guilty. The state doesn't have enough evidence against me. Now, right there, the lawyer now knows the truth of what was done. So the witness comes up, witness who was, say your client assaulted this witness, got in a fight, beat this person up, and the person says, yes, that's in fact the person who did it. And they came up from behind and blah, 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 and they did. And you as a lawyer know that they are in fact telling the truth. But your obligation to your client is to make that witness appear that they're lying. Why? Because if you don't, the jury's going to see, well, clearly the lawyer doesn't believe in their client. So you sort of inadvertently divulge your client's guilt. You know your client is guilty, and by your action you say, well, I can't go after an innocent person. That would be terrible. To make a person appear to be lying when they're telling the truth, that's not morally right. And yet if you do that, you would be in fact telling the jury, oh, well, yeah, everything the witness is saying is true. If you stood up and said, the prosecution said, please tell us what happened, the person tells you, and the next thing you stand up and say, no questions, what does that say to the jury? It says, well, everything that was said, we have no dispute with. So lawyers have an obligation to do things that you or I would probably find morally problematic. If you're telling the truth about something that happened, I'm trying to convince a bunch of people that you're lying, and I know you're telling the truth, you look at me and say, wow, that's a really crappy thing for you to do. Medicine's the same way. Medicine doctors have obligations to keep patient confidentiality. Doctors are not supposed to tell anyone about the condition of their patient without their patient's consent. So doctors have this sort of privilege in medicine. That's their obligation to their patients. They have obligations to treat patients that are put before them. Doctors have an obligation to not harm. And sometimes within professions, in fact, there's debates. For instance, does sometimes treating a patient harm them more than it does good? So is it sort of heroic measures? Are doctors obligated to take heroic measures to save their patients? Do doctors have to listen to their patients when they say they don't want treatment, which they do? Doctors are under an obligation in many cases to withhold treatment. So these sorts of things that doctors can do, they also can do things that you or I can't, even with the consent of a patient. So although there's a doctor before my title, or is my title, if you come to me and say, gee, Dr. Vopat, I really need an appendectomy. I can't afford to go to the hospital. Would you please do one for me? Well, even if you consent to me doing an appendectomy, a very foolish thing for you to do, by the way, but if you were to consent to that, I still can't do it. I'm still not allowed to do that by law. And others say, no. Only medical doctors have the right to cut in. If I did that, I would be or could be charged with assault. I could be charged with practicing medicine without a license. There are a number of different things that would come up. And you say, no, clearly you've done something wrong, when a doctor in a similar situation would not have done anything wrong. And the same goes for psychology, the notion of keeping confidentiality of patients. If you're a psychologist or psychiatrist, the sort of things you say you can't be compelled to divulge that information, or at least you can't be compelled unless the individual has told you they're going to do something, commit a crime or hurt someone. But barring that, there's an overriding obligation to maintain the confidence. And things like education, as I mentioned, those things that provide a valuable service to society. So education might be one of those things where there's a valuable service to society being provided, that you need education to achieve certain ends in society to protect your rights and your liberties. And this might be viewed as a sort of profession as well. That sort of responsibility means that we would apply the title of professional to those in education. Okay, so now how does this all apply to business? Now, if we think about the importance a profession has, if we think about those sorts of examples, and as mentioned in the article, when we talk about what's important to society, we often resort to what John Rawls has called primary goods. So the things like liberty, the ability to pursue your conception of the good life, to pursue the occupations or the professions that you want, rights, duties, obligations, all of these things are what we would consider primary goods. And a profession is something that protects those things or encourages those things or helps us develop those things. Now, business, if we look at what sort of activities people engage in when engaging in business, seems fairly clear that both by Bayle's strict sort of criteria and Barber's sort of looser sufficient conditions, that the business person really doesn't have a separate morality. That we could envision a number of different occupations, business occupations, that if they were gone tomorrow would not have the sort of social impact. This is not to say that business or that economic systems don't help individuals. It's not saying that business is bad or that businesses, corporations can do good. But what we are saying is that even though they do good, one, they're primarily focused on their own well-being, right? The idea that business is there to generate profits, something else that we'll sort of take issue with as we go on in this course. But their effects are sort of side effects, right? They do good indirectly. They provide business within or individuals with income that those individuals can then use that income to buy those sorts of things they need to survive. But business itself doesn't seem to have a separate morality. What kind of special morality would business have? So what we're going to hold is that business ethics really is just ethics. It's really everyday ethics applied to business actions or business situations. So when you're hiring or firing someone, is there a special morality that goes with hiring and firing? Are you given the privilege of hiring and firing people because you don't like their skin color? Is that okay? Well, we think that's probably wrong. If you don't like their sex, well, it's possible this person may get pregnant in some point. So I don't want to hire someone who might get pregnant and then be out or take maternity and cause, these sorts of problems for my business. I might say that's just wrong. There's no special morality. It's not that because you become a business person, now suddenly you abide by different rules. Well, that doesn't seem to be the case. And we can go down the line with manufacturing. Well, it's okay for me to manufacture something that's defective. It's buyer beware. Buyers should check my product out better beforehand. You say, well, no, if you manufacture something or put something on the market that's dangerous to people, then that would be wrong. And so morality requires of us that we're truthful, that we treat people fairly. Non-malfeasance means to not harm other individuals. And we can go down the line, business actions in marketing, sales, and accounting, and so forth. And in fact, the last one, accounting, as we've seen with things like Enron, with Farmore and Youngstown, that accounting doesn't have its separate morality. It's not that when we talk about creative accounting, we normally mean that in as a sort of derisive statement. They engaged in creative accounting. What does that mean? It means they lied in their accounting. And so business ethics really is about ethics. Now, there might be legitimate sort of ethical dilemmas that come up in business. Does a business have a right to do this or that? Should individuals within a business? So one example given in the article is things like whistleblowing. Do employees have moral obligations to their business? Not only contractual obligations as being an employee, but do they have a moral? Do they owe a debt of loyalty to the business? And so there can be these issues that come up in business ethics, and we'll look at some of those sorts of things, how we treat businesses, how we treat corporations, how we should treat them, how individuals in business should act towards others. Those are all legitimate sort of ethical concerns, but they don't require us to posit a separate set of ethics, a separate standard of ethics. The same sort of considerations we have in our everyday life apply in this case in business cases. So business ethics really is about ethics, but applying ethics to business situations. And that's what we're going to be doing throughout the course. As we look at different issues, the presuppositions of business, the presuppositions about markets, how business persons should act. We'll look more closely at some of this role differentiated behavior, whether or not there's some philosophers, business ethicists who've made the case that no, there is in fact a separate set of moral standards for people in business. And we'll talk about that later in the course. But what I want to point out here is that when we think about professions and think about the things we attach profession to, we think about how they're orientated, we think about the training required, we think about what goes on there, that business just doesn't seem to have those criteria. But this, of course, doesn't mean that there aren't ethical issues in business. There are ethical issues, and part of, or a good chunk of this course is going to be talking about what those things are, looking at those various issues. So the subject matter of business ethics, as I've already said, one, it's an examination of the assumptions underlying business practices. So what things do we assume when we go into a business situation? And are those assumptions warranted? So we'll look at, for instance, markets. Should something be in a market is not something we often question in business. So in other words, we can talk about efficient markets and how we work in those markets. Are we treating people fairly in markets? But the other question we might ask is, well, should some things not be for sale? So we'll talk about that later in the course as well. We'll examine some of these underlying assumptions. And I've already mentioned then, we'll also talk about an application of everyday morality in business context. So what should a business person do within this context or with regard to this particular situation? So these are the two things. Now, I want to make one more sort of comment. And this is sort of moving forward in the course, just to give you a general sort of overview. You'll notice that the first portion of the course is going to look at some problematic moral positions, which aren't included in our readings. And I do this for a variety of reasons. We're going to be looking at things called cultural relativism, subjectivism, and the question of does morality depend on religion? And the reason I do this is that oftentimes when we're talking about, if we're going to stick with this concept or idea that business ethics is really just ethics, then we should have a good grounding in what ethics is and what ethics isn't. Which ethical approaches are good, have good reasons for them, and which ethical approaches don't really have good reason for them. And which ethical approaches can we apply sort of universally? In other words, ones that, and this is where the sort of morality and religion question comes in, can we base our sort of business ethics on religion? Or can we base our morality in general on religion? And what might be the problems with that? So we'll start with these positions. And I don't expect you at this point to know what cultural relativism is, subjectivism, or the arguments for and against morality and religion. But I want to sort of point out that the reason why we've made this initial distinction is to show, or at least to make the case in the article, that business ethics is different than professional ethics, that in fact what we're really talking about is ethics applied to business situations and looking at the assumptions of the ethical assumptions in business. But also then that means it's very important for you to understand which moral positions have good reasons for them and which don't. And the first three that you're going to look at in this course really don't have a good reason for holding them. Now, I'll talk more about, for those who immediately are saying themselves, well, religion and morality, of course there's good reason there. I'll further clarify that statement, but what I'm thinking about here, or the way in which I'm sort of framing this, is that what sort of ethical approach can we all agree upon regardless of our religious backgrounds or beliefs? So when we're talking about a public morality, one which would guide business practices, which sort of reasons or approaches could we rely on to sort of make our argument to someone who might not have the same religious convictions or any religion at all for that matter? But we'll talk about that more later. But this is just sort of giving you an idea. Why am I talking about this? Why in a course in business ethics are we talking about these moral positions and these problematic ones? One, because you should know the problems with them. You should understand that. And then as we move on, we'll talk about some of the more popular approaches to morality, which we'll rely on at various points. Various authors that you'll be reading in the textbook have relied on these different moral positions. I'm thinking here about Kantian approaches and virtue ethics and utilitarianism and contract theory. So when we get to these later parts, which you'll be reading about in the book as well, those approaches will be sort of appealed to or mentioned or talked about as we go through the course.